All right, can you all hear me okay? Thumbs up if you can. All right, great, thanks. So this is our fourth session with anxiety, this 10th seminar by Jacques Lacan. We're going to finish this thing in 6. And thankfully, the readings that we got into for today were not crazy. There was some weird stuff, some very interesting stuff, in fact. Buddha's eyelids, or lack thereof, fascinating. We can definitely talk that through as you like. I went ahead and tracked down the statue in question. Check this thing out. I can share the images with you. It's legit. It doesn't have eyes, but it looks like it has eyes. So we can talk about that. There's been a little bit of scholarship out there on this topic. Some of you I know, especially in the Pacifica Graduate Institute crowd, are interested in Eastern philosophy and how this connects with things happening in psychoanalysis, in addition to other figures that you've read that have a debt to Eastern thought. This is one of the places in Lacan's work where you can see his take on it. So in this seminar, he takes a trip to Japan. My understanding is that it's his first of 2 trips that he took to Japan. And in both cases, he was deeply intrigued by the Zen tradition. And here we have him talking through this Bodhisattva statue with the apparent eyes that aren't eyes. We'll see if it comes up. I'm not sure it's entirely relevant to what we're doing, but it could be. It absolutely could be, especially if tonight we can get to some discussion of the drives. You've heard me mention this before. I've told you that in Lacan, you have these 4 different levels operating. There's need, demand, desire, and drive. And it's set up hierarchically. Getting closer to the drive is better than remaining at the level of need. And I'd say if there's a goal or a horizon for Lacanian psychoanalysis, it's keeping the drive alive, figuring out a way to bring analyzans into contact with their drives. And tonight, what I think we can also suggest is that if we can get to the level of the drive, I think what we can suggest is that drive, because it is a partial manifestation and realization of desire, is also a defense against anxiety. So part of the shift I want to make this evening is, in addition to making sure we all understand what we mean by anxiety, we also want to start talking about, okay, now you know what anxiety is. What's the other side of anxiety? How might you coach someone in or out of therapy beyond anxiety? What are some defenses against? We've talked about desire as a defense against anxiety and love as an antidote. To that repertoire tonight, we'll probably add the drive. But I don't want to start there. I want to throw that out as a horizon, and I want to start per usual by taking questions from last time, any key passages or pages you want to make sure that we touch upon tonight. This is your show as much as it is mine. We create these things together.
Hey Sam, how's it going?
Great, thank you.
Hey, I wanted to cover page 188 and 189. It's interesting because Lacan barely ever uses case studies, and this is a sort of a privileged and sort of a strange case study he has, where this woman gets turned on by a car. So yeah, I'm sort of curious about what he's doing here. And maybe to add something to it, just what's the relationship? What does she want him to see here? I think is sort of interesting. Yeah.
Yeah, so you're on page 188. She expresses
180, 188, 189. Yeah.
Small matter whether he desires me, provided he doesn't desire others. There's your clue. And then moving down the page, you get some other good stuff here. God, a car. All right. Yeah, thanks. Let's see what we can do with that.
Yeah.
188 to 189. You know, it ends in this interesting gendered move that he makes about men's anxiety. Is linked to the possibility of not being able. And I mean, think about this. He's toying with the Aristotelian modality known as potentiality, which according to Aristotle also is bound up with impotentiality, with impotence, incapacity, being unable. But think about this too in terms of impotence, as we popularly understand it today, and how that might be linked with men's anxiety. Okay, 188 to 189, got it. Let's see what we can do with that. Anybody else out there remote controlled? What else do you want to say about being remote controlled? It's on page 189, I'm just messing around. Other topics, pages you want to make sure we touch upon, if not delve into tonight.
I mean, I'll just add the anxiety point is something that I'm not exactly sure about. So if we can touch upon that tonight, I think that would be really helpful. Yeah.
Okay, so really just crystallizing as much as we can this definition of anxiety. That we can do. This will be.
I think. So,
go ahead, Cody.
Oh, just anxiety point. I think he mentions that in these 4 chapters. This like sort of median point between jouissance and desire.
Ah, yes.
Yeah. Trying to find
so he starts working up this table that culminates on page 174 at the top. Yeah. And this is a scale up of a table that he's been developing in the previous few chapters. You can also see it getting started on page 161 and 160, both of which are key passages for us. It's something he's been messing with. I don't know that I've seen him take this further, but 174 seems to be the culminating point, with anxiety as this median function, not a mediator, he says at the top of 174, but a median between jouissance and desire. I think we can explain that. It'll take some work though, and it's going to take us manipulating this table, taking it apart and re-articulating it along the lines of the graph of desire. But I think we can do it. And I think it might actually prove pretty damn productive as well. So top of 174, and this discussion that really extends through 175 too, where he's breaking down this table and talking us through it. Okay, what else y'all got? Any other must feature items for tonight? Okay, let's start then by talking about some big others. This is where the discussion begins. In fact, take your book, go all the way back to page 4, and you can see this graph of desire. The big other is in each of the key nodal points. There are 4, and they have circles around them. So the first we discussed is this capital A in a circle, and then to its left, lower italicized S, meaning signified or meaning according to the big other. Upper left-hand quadrant, capital S, parens, barred, capital A, other, a signifier of the other's lack, is how we read that. That capital S is a signifier. It means somebody is showing you, some authority is showing you that they don't have all their shit together, if we could be a little pedestrian about it. Even though in the matheme of the drive, which is in the upper right-hand circle, split subject, lozenge, capital D. That capital D means demand. The big D here comes from the big other, if you will. This is a split subject living their life in relation to the demands of a big other. That, according to Lacan in the 60s, is the matheme for the drive. Now, I think we can make something of that. I think we can work with that. What I want to show you, though, is that the structuring nodal points of the graph of desire all have a big other inside them. And this is important to us for understanding anxiety. So let's talk through, by way of review, each of them. And we'll pause in each case and make sure we're all up to speed. So first, capital A in a circle, the bottom right. Again, we're on page 4 looking at the graph of desire. This is simply the symbolic. This is the big other as a treasure trove of all of the laws, norms, signifiers, you name it. All of the possible answers, meanings in a given situation. This is very much a complete set. Now, of course, we know that it's not really a complete set, because if you follow set theory, you know that any set that purports to contain everything always has to leave one thing out, which is nothing. Nothing is always left out. If this is the set of everything, nothing has been excluded. And Lacan's point is precisely that. I think this is one of the most important things to understand about Lacan's thought. The symbolic is structured atop a lack that it cannot process. A nothing, a no thing that wanders errantly through the symbolic as its essential ingredient. You see, in order for the symbolic's claim to represent every law or every word in the English language, it has to leave something behind, a leftover, a remnant, something that's ejected but not exterior to. There's a kind of extimacy, intimacy combined with an X, something that's outside that has been folded in. And here it's this gap, this nothing, that legitimates the totalizing claim of the symbolic. That's the really important part. Even if the symbolic could account for this nothing, it would push it back underground again because it needs it. In order to represent everything and have that claim be legitimate, nothing has to be left out. So yes, the symbolic purports to be a complete set. My point here is that it is always leaving one thing behind. And this is where Lacan is going to get lots of conceptual traction. So examples of the big A. Earlier in this series, I mentioned before my kiddo was born, talking to my brother and saying, what do I do when it cries? He says, well, there are only 4 possible things that you can do. And he listed the 4. That was the symbolic in that situation. That was the big other. It was the collection of all the possible reactions I could have to a child crying. The OED, Oxford English Dictionary, any dictionary that purports to contain every word in a given language. That's the symbolic at work. It always purports to have all of the laws. The Library of Congress is a great example of the big other embodied. because they want every single book that has ever been published and every record that has ever been produced to be in their collection. That's what we mean by the big A in circle here. It is a complete set of all the possible records in the world. Now, here's the thing. You can't listen to all the records in the world at the same time. You have to choose a few. Similarly, when my kid cried, I couldn't show up with food, a blanket, an opportunity to sleep, a fresh diaper. Feeding a baby and changing its diaper at the same time is like asking for trouble. I had to pick one. That selection from among the totality of options available to me is what we mean by the big other in the lower left-hand quadrant of the graph of desire. That little s means interpretation. It means signified, which means meaning. Meaning according to the big other. So this is a subset of a selection from all of the available responses to a crying baby, right? You can't just open up the OED and read all the words at once. You got to start somewhere. And where you start is a selection from that wider set. For those of you that are working in the clinical field, what else is the DSM but this volume that purports to represent all of the, I shouldn't say mental disorders, characterological abnormalities. And you go through the list and you can figure out where your client, where your patient, where your analysand fits. That's the symbolic. The DSM is the big other. So don't get all caught up in this crazy business of Lacanians talking about the other, the big other, this, that, and the other. What we're talking about here is the symbolic. It's a totalizing set that nevertheless always leaves a something that is nothing out. Now, to its left, though, in the graph of desire, we see a selection from this. This is me choosing to show up with a diaper. I selected from all the possibilities that my brother told me I could choose from, and I showed up with one. This is meaning according to the big other. And you'll recall how we discussed this. This marks the expression of need in language, known as demand. The parent or the primary caregiver interprets the cry of the child and transforms it from an expression of need to a demand that the parent can then make sense of. That's how we get from need to demand in this developmental case. You can see this, though, oftentimes in regular everyday life beyond dealing with little babies and stuff. If you want to know where this other full of answers exists, it's in that person, maybe even a parent of yours, who always has an answer to the question. Someone whom you've never heard say, I don't know. You've heard me mention this before, and it's true. But my dad is one of these people. He's a great guy. But when you ask him a question, even if he doesn't know the answer, he will just stone cold make some shit up. And he's dead serious. Now you might say, hey, wait, what are you doing? He might say, well, I'm just speculating. I'm just guessing that that's there and that this is what's going on. I had to learn this the hard way. About a decade ago, I bought a house. It was an old place. We were doing a lot of work on it. This is how my dad and my brother always do it. One of us buys an old house and the other two show up, and then we punch it out and get the thing fixed up and ready. Well, one of the things I learned when it was my turn is that my dad shows up and he likes to wonder, what is behind wall number 1? Could there be some electrical in there? Might that be the exit line for the tub? He wonders what's behind wall number 1, and what he proposes, very seriously, is what he calls an exploratory cut, where he basically gets a sawzall. If you know what these are, it's a reciprocating saw. And he puts a hole in the wall and then puts his head in there and just looks around. I'm like, fool, that is not good business. He's like, well, that's how we're going to find out what's in here. He had an answer to the question. What's behind wall number 1? He had an answer about how to get answers. This is somebody, a big other embodied, literally a parent here, who can never admit that they don't have the answers. In other words, who can never admit that they lack. Now, the reason why this is important for us is that if you look above this iteration of the big other, you see the opposite. Not a big other that has all the meanings and has selected the appropriate. Above this, you have a signifier of a big other that lacks. This happens when you realize that the person you're dealing with doesn't have all their shit together. The person whom you perhaps thought had all the answers turns out to be just a normal person like you. This would be the point at which my dad, to continue with the example, might stammer a little bit when I ask him a question about who knows what. That would be a signifier of the fact that he's about to make some shit up because he doesn't have an answer. So that's a really clean way to read the upper left-hand quadrant of the big other. This is a signifier of lack in one of these big others. Something seems to be off, missing in this individual. Of course, we know that all big others lack for the reason I pointed out earlier regarding set theory. Because any claim to totality and containment of everything must by necessity leave something out, a something that is nothing. And when that nothing pops up, this is where the state, this is where the big other, this is where the parent stammers. This is where the cop drops his baton. This is where something in the otherwise polished edifice of authority reveals that it's a little bit cracked, a little bit broken. So you see this constantly in media portrayals of the President of the United States, Joe Biden. One of the classic ones that keeps popping up at this point is him, after delivering a speech, turning away from the podium and looking around as though he doesn't know where he is. Either he's looking for somebody who's no longer there, or he's trying to find his way off stage. He can't quite figure it out. And then some clever memer writes the caption underneath. Me when blah, 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 blah. The reason why this is significant is because this is the head of state, the executive of the executive branch in our country. We expect them to be clean, polished, damn near perfect, which isn't to say that they're not mistaken. It's to say that they're always on top of shit. So there are numerous examples of each of these big others. You'll notice what I'm leaving aside right now is the definition of the drive. But this is what we have so far for the first three big others that concern us. The reason why I've scaled it up this way is that when we see a signifier of lack in the big other, in some authoritative figure, we can't help but wonder where their desire is pointed. You see, if someone or something lacks, that means that it leaves something to be desired. That means that it experiences desire. A display of lack tells us that somebody is a desirous being, just like us. Not somebody like the big A in a circle who has everything. You see, the big A in the circle, the proper big other, has everything. It contains everything. Across from that, a signifier of lack in the other shows you that no, on the contrary, this is a big other who's missing something. And as a result, probably desires it. Now you can see why I've got this scaled up. Because the next question is, what does that have to do with me? Is it something about me that the big other lacks? Is it something that I have that they want? How am I caught up in the desire of the big other? which is why immediately after presenting the graph of desire, also Lacan shifts to the praying mantis example, which is where we started our work 4 sessions ago. I won't rehearse the example because you know it all too well. It's important, though, that the female praying mantis is big, desirous, and perplexing to us there in our ambiguous mask. This is how we start with anxiety. Anxiety occurs somewhere along the way there for the neurotic. The starting place for anxiety is a breakdown of fantasy. And on page 4, you can see fantasy, midway between the two desirous big others that I was talking about. Fantasy, the matheme for fantasy, a split subject living their life in relationship to little a, our key topic for last time and this tonight, is midway between these two big others. And when fantasy begins to falter, when we start to lose traction on what we think other people want for us, we usually respond to them in one of 2 ways. If we turn right out of fantasy and head up to a signifier of the lack in the other, for the neurotic, that's going to be the path of anxiety. If fantasy starts to falter and we turn right out of fantasy in the graph of desire, we see the big other as desirous and we freak out. Because the reason why we have fantasy in the first place is because we don't know what we want. We are split subjects, hence the split subject in the matheme for fantasy, living our life in relationship to what we think other people want. Now, I've already told you how we got to that point, from desire for to desire of to desire as. This is a scale up for fantasy. But now that we're here at fantasy, there sometimes occur moments when we lose traction and we start to realize, holy shit, I don't know what I want, which is why I built this fantasy around what I imagine your desires to be. But it turns out I just saw a signifier of your lack, which tells me that you don't fucking know what you want either. OMG, you're just like me. That's what we're talking about here. You don't know what you want either. That is a cause for anxiety. This is the seedbed for anxiety with the neurotic. Now, the pervert enjoys all of this. The pervert says, oh, you're incomplete. You don't know what you want. I'm sure it's me. Climb on top and find out. Let me be what daddy told me I couldn't, which is to say, you're phallus. We'll come to that in a minute. And I say daddy, of course, in a highly figurative sense, because what I'm talking about is a paternal function. The paternal function comes in and says, mommy, or maternal function, whoever occupies that position, does not have the phallus. And baby cannot be it for her. This is that dialectic in Lacan between having and being. The pervert is somebody who disavows that moment and says, oh, on the contrary, Poppy, I can absolutely be that for her. I accept that she doesn't have it, but by God, if I'm not going to try and be it for her. That's a disavowal of the paternal function. And of course, in the case of the psychotic, where the paternal function is completely foreclosed, like it never even happened, the whole thing is just right over their heads. We may come to that a little bit later, but it has been a kind of leitmotif for some of the work that we've been doing. Now, when fantasy falters, and let's be clear about this, this is one of those moments where you no longer feel sure that you're, I don't know, dressing like everybody thinks you should dress, where you're not quite sure that this is what everybody wants for you. This could be one of those moments where you're at a fork in the road in your life. and you've talked to all the great advisors that you have, and you've asked them, should I do X or should I do Y? And you get two great people giving you two completely different answers. I'm like, wait a minute, my fantasy is that if I can just do what you want, then I'll be whole again. Then I'll be straight, we'll be good, it's all, nah. Fantasy breaks down in these moments. The other option is to turn left out of fantasy and head back down to a big other who's able to tell you what it all means. So this is not anxiety. This is this recursive, regressive cycle of demand that Lacan talks about in the 40s and 50s of this book. We mapped this one already, so I won't go through it again. Again, this is all by way of review. And what that basically says is, whoa, I'm no longer certain what it is that you want for me. But you know what, big other? Come on. I know that you know what you want for me. So just tell me what it is. This is what the neurotic wants more than anything, as Lacan puts it in this seminar. For the big other to issue him or her a demand. Tell me what to do. That left turn out of fantasy back down into a big other that has all the answers and can choose them diligently is a demand for the other to issue a demand. And you'll recall what we did with this. The split subject courses their way back through the graph of desire, all the way up until demands are all emptied out at what Lacan in this seminar calls the bottom barrel of demand, D0. And the only thing that the big other can reply to after your repeated request that they issue a demand, they can only reply by saying, show me your castration. What I want is what splits you. What I want is for you to be split and to show it to me. Now we'll get into these details again tonight, but this is what we're seeing on page after page early on in the seminar. What the neurotic does not want to do is to show up and present their castration to the big other. This is a roundabout way of getting at exactly what they tried to avoid by turning left at the faltering of fantasy, namely anxiety. The neurotic source of anxiety is when the big other forces them to show up for circumcision. Or at least, let me be clear, to prove that they've been circumcised. Show me. Prove that you've been circumcised. Show me where you've been cut. Show me, in other words, what you lack, in this case, a foreskin. Circumcision is also a key theme throughout this seminar, as you've seen. It keeps coming back to this topic again and again and again. Why? Because it's the great example of little a, which is that little piece of flesh, which is very important here that it's a part of the body, that is cut off and as leftover, as a remainder, as waste, is cast aside. Little a as your first lost object. And the basic structure for the human subject's relationship to their body from here on out. Lacan says all this. This is not me just making shit up. It's right on the page in front of us. So we have these two choices. When fantasy falters, we can choose to deal with the other as desirous and run the risk of anxiety, or we can force them to issue a demand. But all that really does is prolong the inevitable, which is them demanding to see the evidence of our lack. Why? So they can take it. Anxiety is when your lack has been taken by somebody else. or as Lacan playfully puts it, when lack itself is lacking. Now, this is not more complicated than having a smothering, imminently present, enveloping primary caregiver who never gives the kid any breathing room. What's being taken from us in moments of anxiety is space between ourselves and another person. So in a good relationship, for instance, as grown-ups, you can tell your partner that you need a little space. You can say things like, I need to go get some air. I need to just take a break. Hell, maybe you need to take a break from the relationship. That's how much space you need. And sometimes at the end of a phone conversation, things might get intense. Like, you know what? I gotta go. I can't talk about this with you right now. We say shit like that. Those are all ways of staving off anxiety by imposing space between ourselves and other people. What anxiety does is it never lets us hang up the phone. Anxiety is what happens when we forget how to take space in relationships. And the reason we forget is because that space has already been taken from us by our partner, usually. The same way that mommy took it from us. Or if yours was a daddy. Maternal functions can be performed by whomever. My point here is that to see the other as desirous is dangerous. It's dangerous because it threatens to take from us the very cause for existence, namely the cause of desire. What else is depression but waking up in the morning and having no desire? This is the worst form of human life. The worst experience in the world is to have no desire, to not want to do anything, and to feel like you can't do anything. To have your desire taken from you is usually an indication that somebody has poached your lack. They have swiped your cause, taken the space that you need in order to be yourself, and enveloped you in their presence. Now, we had a formula for this, which I'm going to bring up again, just to give us a sense by way of a jolt of what we're up to. Okay, do you all see this black screen? Thumbs up. Okay. The formula that we were working with looked something like this. The desire of the big other, here they are, in relationship to the cause of our desire as split subjects. And the way we read this is as follows. If you just look at this side of the equation, you've got a picture of what it looks like to experience desire as a subject. Here is the cause of our desire, which is always lack. This is the experience of lack. Little a here symbolizes what it feels like to miss out, to feel like you don't have something. This is the object. This is what we want. Down here, though, is why we want it. What happens when anxiety strikes is that a desirous other shows up and is larger than that which defines us. And they take it for themselves. The cause of our desire becomes the object of the other's desire. This is anxiety. If you want a formula for it, this is it. The desire of a big other larger than the cause of ours makes our cause of desire their object of desire. And as a result, fucks us up, to put it bluntly. Now, as usual, I will save these, even though I believe that we have this one already in the books. Now, while we have this in front of us, I can see you, but I bet you can't see me. I don't know, actually. Can you see me still? Oh, you do? Okay, great. That's wonderful, because I can see you too. So looking at this formula, what questions do you have so far?
I kind of haven't wrapped my head around our lack is the object of the other's desire. Like, I get it, but like, is there like another example that you can use, like, that can kind of solidify what that really means?
Well, let's march it back a little bit. Let's imagine a childhood scenario where, let's say you've got a parent who is frequently unhinged. That could mean every Friday night, you know they're coming home drunk, but you might not be sure how drunk they are. And you're not quite sure how they're going to fuck with you or your other parent or your siblings in those moments. So here is a parent that is wildly unpredictable, overwrought, inconsistent, in short, dangerous to us. A child growing up in a situation like this is going to spend all their time worrying about the future. What is about to happen? What are they going to do when they get home? What's going to happen to my little brother? I would really like to leave the house, but I feel like I need to be there to protect him. What's going to occur if I stick around? What's going to occur if I don't stick around? In this moment, the child spends all their time anxiously anticipating what might happen next, what the big other might do when they get home from the bar. In this moment, we see anxiety because the child is overwhelmed by the unpredictability of the big other in their life, in this case, a parent. That feeling of being overwhelmed and enveloped, completely preoccupied by what mood the other is going to be in, is a definition of anxiety. And the reason why it's anxiety and the reason why it functions as a lack of lack is because you are so preoccupied and so immersed in all the different possibilities of what might go wrong when daddy or mommy gets home on Friday night that there's no room for you. This is a kid who does not live in a household that is a containing or holding environment for them. This is a child whose container is leaky, is porous. It doesn't provide them with the requisite safe space to be imaginative, to be playful, to sleep at ease, to just kind of drift off. I'll give you an example of this. One of my favorite things that happens at my house is when my kid gets into the shower. I like when she's in the shower because it gives me a minute to be like, okay, we got dinner done. What's the next move here? It just gives me a second to kind of like check in. But the reason I really like it when she's in the shower is because she sings when she's in there. She makes up songs. I have like a glass shower door that she writes on, and she draws little pictures. She pees in there. She hangs out. She does all kinds of weird shit. She's in her own world, singing her little songs. The reason why that makes me happy is that it tells me that she feels safe enough, held enough, contained enough in my house to be able to just kind of like be a kid. She's not worried that someone's going to come charging through the door and do some crazy ass shit. She is able to just be in there with plenty of space between her and the adults in her life. If she were an anxious kid, she would be in the shower constantly calling for me, wanting to make sure the door was locked before she got in there. She would be completely preoccupied with all the possible interruptions, insinuations that an adult might have. Stumbling into the bathroom, screaming on the other side of the wall. She's not worried about any of that. And as a result, she has this space to pursue her own desire. She sings songs about like little relationships, boyfriends and girlfriends and stuff like that, princes and princesses. She draws pictures of landscapes that aren't in the household, little mountains, little houses and trees, animals and stuff. She couldn't do that if she was anxious. So one of the tests, for instance, I'm no psychologist, but I've heard that this is one of the tests for how well a kid is doing, is how easily are they able to immerse themselves in imaginative play? How carefree are they able to just slip into play? So this would be more like before you get to structured talk therapy, maybe more along the lines of like what happens in play therapy. And a kid who's really guarded, who lives with anxiety, is going to be a kid who doesn't allow themselves to slip into imaginative play as easily. They might be defended, they might be avoidant. I don't know what the proper terms are for this kind of stuff. But this would be perhaps a red flag for the psychologist. And they might wonder, okay, what's this kid's home life like? That they feel like they have to be so guarded around others. You could see, for instance, drop a kid off at school and you'll see kids that have separation anxiety, especially in the first week, especially among like kindergartners and first graders and preschoolers. They can't let go of the parent. Now that's a pretty normal thing, but major separation anxiety that doesn't go away suggests something. Think about it. The child is so used to the overwhelming presence of an unpredictable parent. They're so used to it that they can't let that parent go when they finally have a chance to flee and go to school and have that parent not around. Anxiety, like every characterological abnormality and every maladaptive trait we develop, it can become habitual. You might not like it, but at least you know it. It's familiar. So these are some examples. The reason why we call this lack as lacking is because in this case, the kid doesn't feel like they have a sufficient buffer zone between themselves and the desirous parent. Let me give you one more example, Desiree, because I think your question is a really good one here. Think about a child that hears a primary caregiver whispering to another primary caregiver in the other room. And they come out of their bedroom and they say, "What are you guys talking about?" Now, one primary caregiver could turn to the child and say, "We're just talking about how big your dad's cock is." The kid's gonna be like, "Whoa, whoa, 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 what? I didn't know daddy kept chickens." That's a bad answer, right? A better answer is, we're talking about adult stuff. You don't have to worry about it. Go back to your room. Don't worry about it. We're just talking about adult stuff. Or you say something like this. "Oh, it's just boring work stuff. We're just talking about the chores we're going to do this weekend," even though you're totally having a fight about who's going to vacuum the floor. So what this does is the primary caregiver imposes a barrier, imposes some distance between the issues that preoccupy them and the child. That imposure of distance is a preservation of the child's ability to lack, to have an opening or a space between them and their big others. The bad answer is the one when the child shows up where the parent says, yeah, we're just talking about how we might not be able to make rent this month. And so there's a good chance we're probably going to have to go live at grandma's again. You think that kid is going to sleep well that night? Absolutely not. That kid has now been introduced to anxiety. What's been taken from them is the requisite space that children need between kiddo issues and grown-up issues, Lacan would say. This is the basic definition of trauma for Lacan. Trauma is just whatever you're not ready for. So for instance, you can be a grown-ass person and pull up at the intersection, see somebody get hit by a car with their brains spilling out, and fucking lose it. That is a traumatic event because you are not used to seeing brain on pavement. That same event, though, for the EMT who's sitting in the passenger seat of your car is not traumatic because they are used to seeing brain on pavement. Trauma for Lacan is not a complicated concept. It's being exposed to something that you're not ready for. And the bigger the deal, the sharper the exposure, the less preparedness, the more traumatic it is. This is the weird thing about humans. We are incredibly adaptable. Second only, I would say, to our ability to use hands for something other than locomotion. People talk about the opposable thumb, but it's really the whole hand. Our manual capacity is what enabled us to become these beings. But right up there with it, what the hand in turn did was it made us one of the world's most adaptable organisms. It's why we are one of the only species that lives on every single inch of this earth. We can get used to anything. I used to work with some guys in an anger management group, and they were all ex-cons. And some of them been down for 30 years, some been down for 5 years, old, young. We had grandpas, we had all ages in this group. Some of them acted in ways and even professed very directly that they would just rather be back in the can. They're like, at least in the can, I had respect. I knew what was what. I had my place. 3 hots and a cot. I was in business. Out here, I'm sleeping in my fucking car. Nobody will hire me. I can't get shit together. My kids won't talk to me. I talked to them more when I was in prison than when I got out. And now I'm tempted to use again. And I got in a fight this weekend. And I got arrested again. And it's almost at some level that these guys, some of them, not a lot, but some of them were willing their way back to prison. And you'd ask them, is that a good place to be? Fuck no. Tripping, that's the worst place you could be in your life, son. And yet, there I go, right back into it, because it's what I know. Humans are adaptable like that. So we can get used to anything. And events that were traumatic in the past, we can become numb to them later. But usually it works out in different ways. The child who experiences traumatic violence is the kid who also becomes a bully at school. Not always, but that can happen. The thing that they can't handle in their own lives, like everything else human, gets projected right back out into the world. Is this sufficient as an example and an answer to your question, Desiree?
Yeah, I just wanted to clarify the part, so just for the first example is the object of the desire, and use the caregiver impinging on the ability of giving the child a holding environment. So then what is the object of the desire? Like having a holding enough environment? Like, sorry, I'm like, my brain's just trying to kind
Yeah.
of put it in like structure or something.
Yeah. There are two good bumper stickers that can help us through this. One is misery loves company. And so also with desire. People who are exorbitantly desirous usually enjoy producing desire in others. Extreme forms of desire. People who are terribly overwrought can sometimes be the people who most provoke similar feelings in others. You can run this through Lacan's formulation for hysteria and come up with some pretty good stuff. The other one that I like is hurt people hurt people. Almost inevitably, the overly desirous parent who provokes anxiety in the child is themselves anxious as hell. And if you're anxious as hell, it makes you feel like the world is always coming after you, always closing in on you. So you might feel like, in other words, that you need and would welcome a little bit of lack, a little bit of space. So why not take it from somebody else? Why not take theirs? Maybe that'll finally help me. Maybe if I take your little a, I won't feel so smothered and enveloped in my own life. So to summarize here, the overwhelming, enveloping, smothering presence of some parent leaves no space, no room, no opening, or no gap in which a kid can be a kid. What's taken from the child in this moment is lack, is the space needed to cultivate their own desire. And that's how we get, again, this definition of anxiety, where lack itself is lacking. Let me put it a little more clearly in line with the formula that you have in front of you. And again, these are all sessions that are being recorded, so you can go back and fuck with this phrase later. But let me be really crystal clear about this. The object of the other's desire is the opening in which I would otherwise develop my own. That's what that formula says. The object of their desire is the opening in which I would otherwise formulate my own. It's the cause of my desire, lack, that the desirous other takes from me when they envelop me, never give me a moment to myself. That's what happens when anxiety strikes. In other words, it is my capacity for desire, my ability to want, that's missing when anxiety strikes. This is why desire is a defense against anxiety. And when anxiety hits, what it preys upon is your capacity for desire. The key question here for us, the most difficult of the bunch, is this thing, this object of anxiety, this little a. That I take to be the core of what Desiree is asking here. Like, what is this lack that gets taken from a kid? Lacan himself admits that this is a pretty difficult topic. People ask him, what is the object of anxiety? Because we've heard from Sartre, Heidegger, and others that anxiety means having no object. Fear has an object. You know what you're afraid of. Anxiety, though, doesn't have one. Lacan's response is, anxiety does have an object, but it's not like any other object in the world. It's not like a bear chasing you down the street. And so the phrase that he uses here, he says, anxiety is not without an object. I'm going to stop sharing here. You've seen this formula enough so that we can look at the book together. The first place that we talked about last time where Lacan trots out this object cause, this object that's not really an object, is on page 89 at the top. What we're really getting at here is a definition of objet, of little a. This little a that is the cause of desire that fucks with Lacanians left and right. The top of 89, as we discussed last time, anxiety is not without an object. But again, it's not an ordinary object. The object in question here is elusive, it's enigmatic, it's obscure, it's unusual. It's not an object, but what Lacan is eventually going to call an object cause. Check out page 131. He takes another swipe at this topic at the beginning of chapter 10. There it is again. Anxiety is not without an object. He's emphasizing it. He's not just going to come out and say anxiety has an object and the object is this. He has to say it a little weird because he wants to like shift your perspective a little bit. He wants our perspectives to shift a little bit. What we're looking at here is not really an object. I'll be clear about this in a second. But right now, let's just look at what he's got here. This doesn't mean that this object is accessible by the same path as all the rest. I've already emphasized that to say that a discourse that is homologous to, or similar to any other part of scientific discourse can symbolize this object can put us alongside it in the relationship of symbol to which we shall be coming back later, would be yet another way of getting rid of anxiety. Although anxiety sustains this relationship of not being without an object, it is on the condition that we are not committed to saying, as one would of another object, which object is involved, nor even to be able to say which. In other words, anxiety introduces us with the accent of utmost communicability to a function that is, for our field, radical, the function of lack. 131 is really the Bible for what he's working at here in this seminar. He's telling you that this is the big deal topic, the function of lack. The reason why he wants to study anxiety, among others, is that it turns us on to this very odd, enigmatic field of objectility. Now that is key. Objectivity is what modern science is into. It's what pure reason is all about. Lacan's going to say what he deals with is objectility, which has nothing to do with objects. It's fundamentally about causes. Objectility is about what he calls the pathos of the cut. It's about the cause of desire, not its object. And that's what that formula I drew for you tonight shows. The cause of your desire, lack, becomes the object or the target of someone else's. What they want is to see you squirm. They want to see you fumble. This also, don't forget, is the reason why Lacan keeps coming back to sadism and masochism. The sadist doesn't get off, again, on inflicting pain. What they get off on is provoking anxiety. The sadist gets out the whip, don't forget. And what gets them off is not hitting you with it, but showing it to you, along with the pronouncement verging on legislation itself, You've been a very bad boy. You deserve this. I hereby pronounce you. I hereby decree capital punish. You are about to receive, fill in your basic court rhetoric here, 50 lashes across your bare, elderly, white, propertied, extremely wealthy, heteronormative CEO of Twitter ass. And that's what happens. But before that whipping occurs, there's this elaborate linguistic setup, a staging of the event. This is where the sadist enjoys, because this is where the white man in ties begins to squirm and saying, yes, I have been a bad boy, you're right. I've been pilfering from people for years, or whatever the fuck it is. You know? That provocation of anxiety is what gets the sadist off. That's the source of their enjoyment. And the masochist, in turn, gets off on provoking anxiety in others at the fundamentally dilapidated state of their being. The masochist gets off on only wearing shredded, used clothes around their conservative parent. So the parent can say, what the hell? You dress like a homeless person. Why can't you dress a little bit nicer? You're never going to get a job if you leave the house dressed like that. Listen to how they get all riled up just based on how you dress. This is a really classic thing among teenagers, right? The teenager comes downstairs ready to go to school, dressed in a way, acting in a way, looking in a way that the parent or primary caregiver doesn't approve, and the parent or the primary caregiver loses their shit. Saying things like, why would you do that to yourself? Or as someone I once knew, mother told her, why are you trying to make yourself ugly? Now, I'm not saying that this old friend of mine was a masochist, but if she were, this would be a source of enjoyment for her, watching her mother squirm in this way. Let's pause there and see where you are. I'll always give us a moment, but not too many, because we have other bridges to cross.
What would you say is the difference between anxiety and paranoia?
That is such a great question, Oliver. At a couple of moments tonight, I have been inclined to say that paranoia is the peak of anxiety. Now, what we know in the Lacanian tradition is that paranoia is a subset of the clinical structure known as psychosis, right? Anxiety is something that neurotics are usually more wrapped up in. But here's the thing. There are some Lacanians who say that there is no passageway between these clinical structures. I don't believe that. And I think there's evidence, ample evidence in Lacan to say that he doesn't believe that either. Now, there's probably evidence to the contrary as well. That's why little a is so difficult, because Lacan was constantly shifting the meaning of this thing over like 25 years. It's a challenging phenomenon because it's there with him at the start of his career and there with him at the end of his career. And it means different things at each stage. We're at one stage right now. We're at the stage in which little a becomes affiliated with the real. That's why he's talking about the pound of flesh. We're going to talk about that tonight. Prior to this, it was more closely associated with fantasy. You see that little a in there? An imaginative prop. Later on in life, it'll be at the center of the Borromean links. So little a is all over this guy's work, and depending on what year you find him, it's going to mean something different. So what I'm giving you is what it means for him in the early 60s, around the topic of anxiety. What we know about Lacan, though, is that the ego has a fundamentally paranoid structure. There's a very real sense in which the basic figure of normalcy namely having a functioning ego, almost certainly overly functioning ego, is itself a kind of paranoia. The ego is a paranoid MFer. Each of our egos is fundamentally paranoid, which is why the temptation of narcissism is so great. Everybody is interested in me. Everybody wants to know what I'm up to. I'm the center of everyone's attention. What else is that but a paranoid structure? So what I'd like to suggest is that it's not only tempting, but I think legit to read paranoia as an extreme form of anxiety. And let's not forget that we find ourselves here on April 20th, 420, the 420th of days. Think about the effects of anxiety on the verge of paranoia that some of us have experienced, and not just from smoking pot, man. Think about some of the effects of psychedelic use when that shit goes south. Some of you have been on trips that you wish would just stop. It's like the 14th hour and you're like, holy shit, I have to go to work. Is this over yet? And think of all the figments that have chased you around the room in those late nights. Doesn't mean you lost your mind. Hell, if anything, it means you probably found it. So yeah, Oliver, I think it's a great question. My inclination, and here when I answer these questions, I want you to know all this. I'll always try and tell you when what I'm saying is something from me, but rest assured, when I tell you something's from me and it's in this Lacanian context, I am building on the logic presented by Lacan's argument. Logic, which I would mind you, sometimes he himself doesn't even follow. So there are times when it is important to out-Lacan Lacan. Because sometimes even he himself gets twisted up in these concepts. But we, with the availability of hindsight, don't forget, he's doing all of this shit live. Yeah, he has some notes, but this is a transcript. Come on, man, thousands of pages of somebody up on stage, 20 years, dealing with some pretty heavy stuff. You know they're going to slip up a little bit here and there. Some people like to make a big fuss out of these moments. I don't see them as important or unimportant. I read Lacan for the coherence and for the systematicity of his work, second only to Hegel in terms of systematicity in Western thought. Way up there, right up there with Heidegger in terms of developing a systematic line of thought and Kant that hangs together conceptually. And Lacan's does that. So oftentimes I'll build on structures and conceptual moves in his work to say things like I just did, which is that yes, paranoia is the peak of anxiety, if you think about it. Now there are going to be some big differences, and this is where we would get in a row with the Lacanians, because the clinical structure of paranoia is anchored in psychosis, which has a very different relationship to the symbolic than the neurotic who experiences anxiety. So we could dig in here and find all kinds of ways why paranoia could never be an extension of anxiety. But for our purposes, I think it's useful to think about this on a spectrum where paranoia would be the outer limit. Think about it. The world is out to get me. All of these enormous imaginary others are bearing down on me constantly. The aliens are trying to read my thoughts, so I have to wrap my head in tinfoil. Vladimir Putin is hacking into my bank account. Who's listening to this Skype call? Oh, I don't use Zoom because Zoom is a highly surveilled platform and it's not safe. Our discussions are not protected there. I got to change my passwords. Did you know the average millennial changes their passwords more than they have sex? Put that in your fucking pipe on 420. So does that mean that they are all psychotic? No. It means that anxiety can be tinged with paranoia, the same way that the ego, when functioning all too well, can have a paranoid structure. Great question. I hope that answers it. What else y'all got out there?
Yeah, I have another question, sort of to Oliver's question as well, but taking it down in the direction of sort of the depressive or the melancholic. I think, I don't know, it's interesting. I mean, like Freud in his essay, Mourning and Melancholia, it's all about the loss of the object, right? However, I think if we read Lacan seriously about anxiety and sort of thought about it, thought about melancholia in a similar fashion, it would be sort of this, I don't know, traumatic kind of enveloping of the object, right? I have to get the fuck away from this thing. How do I get away from it? I mean, an interesting fantasy, and then I'll shut the fuck up, is of the depressive is I need to get away from society. I need to get away from all big others. I mean, you think of a good example is like Christopher McCandless, right? Like Into the Wild, that guy, or anybody who is slightly depressed and needs to get away. They'll have that fantasy of breaking away from sort of these symbolic structures, right? Or you know, getting away from the big other, which determines their social existence. So yeah, maybe, I don't know. I guess what I'm trying to say is that maybe the melancholic is the peak of one side of anxiety. You know? Yeah.
Because melancholic, in either case, the object is lost. The melancholia, they can't let go of it. They can't let it go. So mourning, unlike melancholy, is when you've actually let the object go. The melancholic can't quite let it go. The fucking thing is gone, but they can't quite let it go. And that's how we get, you know, people like this, where you encounter them years later and you're like, damn, you are still shitty with me about that. You just cannot let it go. There will even be times when you'll meet somebody from your past and they'll be talking to you and it'll be like they're talking to somebody else. They're looking right at you, but you don't actually identify with their addressivity. They are speaking to you, but you do not feel addressed because you're not the person to whom they're speaking. Or for instance, you'll be talking with somebody and they'll say some shit to you and you'll be like, damn, you must have had a bad day. Because clearly I didn't do anything to provoke that kind of a response from you. Holy shit. What world did you just project onto me? Let it go. Truly important here in the shift from melancholy to mourning. And I want to say that, Cody, this is actually a really great way to define what Lacan is doing with an object here around anxiety. I'm glad you bring this up. Little a is a lost object. It's the first and to some extent the only lost object. It's the symbol of whatever object has been lost. But let me be clear. When Lacan says anxiety is not without an object, the object in question is not an object, but an opening in which an object has been removed, is missing, and is thus experienced as lost. In short, lacking. Let me be clear about that. Let me say it again. What we're dealing with here is not an object, but the opening, a void, if you will, in which an object has been removed and is now missing and crucially experienced as lost. That experience of loss is lack. It's to feel like you're missing something that you want so badly that sometimes you feel like you even need it. Now, we have seen this before. The symbol that Lacan initially offers for this space is this. This is the space or the opening that is created when a certain object has been removed. And this is that object, the phallus. Now, let's recall very quickly how we mapped this thing out. So there's this pre-Oedipal triangle that Lacan is messing with here, where you've got the child. You'll recall this from our early work together. And then the maternal function, occupied by whoever plays that part for you. And the child initially, you'll recall, has desire for the body of this person. Care for me, take care of me, etc., etc. What the child notices is that this primary caregiver also is interested in other stuff. It can be their phone, it can be their job, it can be whatever and wherever their attention is directed other than at the child. And so what the kid learns to do is to identify with this in order to gain access to that. Here we see the desire of mother transforming and affecting the child's desire itself. Now, I say this is pre-Oedipal. It's fundamentally imaginary. All right. Pre-Oedipal here too, so you can recall it. This is the imaginary phallus. It's whatever you imagine the primary caregiver is interested in addition to you. Are you all with me so far on this? Okay. Now, this is where a lot of post-Freudian work begins and ends, if it even gets this far. What makes Lacan great is that he does not stop there in the least, because he turns this imaginary triangle into a symbolic square by introducing another person, the paternal function. This is the name, and don't forget it's also the no, of the father. We've been over this, so I'm going to move fast. What this individual does, as you well know, is it cuts in and says, child, you cannot be this for the maternal function. And whoever's playing the maternal function, and you don't have it in the first place. So here's that riff again. Mommy doesn't have it, and baby can't be it for her. This process of cutting in fundamentally negates the imaginary phallus. And what it does, in effect, I want to draw this live and in motion so you can see the effect that this has. The effect looks something like this. Do you see what I'm doing? I am imposing distance. I am opening up a gap or a space. Between the child and the primary caregiver. This gap or space is symbolized by A, which is why I've always told you that little a is the irreducible minimum distance between 2 points that allows them to remain distinct. The goal of the paternal function is to intrude on this imaginary triangle, subtract the phallus and all of the desire games that the child plays with the maternal figure, and introduce some space in between here. Space that is initiated by the logic of prohibition. She doesn't have it, and you can't be it for her. Little a is the symbol of that irreducible space that the paternal function, when it is accomplished, imposes between these two figures. Anxiety is what happens when the primary caregiver totally overrides this and starts to encroach upon the child in whatever capacity it is. Now we have a child who is not contained and held, but for those of you that are interested in other post-Freudian trajectories, this is a child that now suffers from impingement. This is a child that is impinged upon. When Lacan uses the word anxiety, you can substitute it for what British object relations folks refer to as impingement. I'm not saying you can do so cleanly, but I'm saying that you can render that analogous. So here it is again. What we're dealing with in anxiety is not an object, but the opening in which an object has been removed. In this case, an imaginary object is missing and is experienced as lost, in short, lacking. Little a is the symbol for this opening after the imaginary phallus has been removed. And if this triangle that we were working with was imaginary, you know where I'm going to go with this. The square introduced by the paternal function with these four nodal points is not imaginary, but symbolic. This negative phi that A comes to replace is the space, the opening, a gap, some breathing room left after the pursuit of the imaginary phallus has been prohibited. Mom can't have it, child can't be it. This is exactly also what the psychotic forecloses, what the pervert disavows, and what the neurotic represses. That's important. But let me be clear about that. Repression has built into it an acceptance. In fact, if you look at repression and you march it back through all the various phases, you're going to have a system that has like 6 different layers, each retroactively presupposed by its predecessor. You can read this in Freud and Lacan. Repression presupposes negation. Negation presupposes affirmation. An affirmation presupposes the name of the Father, which presupposes an imaginary order into which the name of the Father intrudes. An imaginary order that emerges from something that we might call the here and now of the all in becoming, a kind of presence that only animals experience, bioanimality. All of this is baked into a repression. The reason why I'm pointing this out is because if the psychotic forecloses the name of the Father, if the pervert disavows it, and the neurotic represses it, let's be clear about that. Repression includes and has baked into it an acceptance of the thing that is repressed. an acknowledgement or affirmation of its existence, and then a negation that can then be repressed. In order to repress something, you have to acknowledge its existence as something out there in the world with an effect that is dangerous to you. The psychotic doesn't even acknowledge that shit. If you're interested in this, we can just take the detour and I can walk you through each of these steps. Otherwise, we'll just move on. This would be the a priori structure of repression. But we don't need to get into that. We've got other stuff to talk about. So again, what you see here with this little a, this is just the marker. It's just an algebraic sign that Lacan has chosen to designate this opening, really to mark any sort of opening, an irreducible distance between any two entities that allows them to remain distinct. I can't emphasize that enough. Okay, let's pause for a couple more questions about anything that you've heard in the past few minutes, and then we'll look to take a little bit of a break.
I don't know if this is so much a question, but I keep, and you've kind of touched it, but I keep going between the lack as lost versus having been taken, right? Because when we tie it back to castration, right, it's not something that just like, oh, wait, where did that go? Right, it was removed. And then capture that in the void, like the opening of the thing that was removed. And I think that feels like a pretty critical distinction.
Yeah.
To something, someone or thing negated that from me. It wasn't just clumsy or, sort of like an unforeseen vaporized situation.
Brilliant. Yeah, this is really one of the key conceptual moves that Lacan makes. And the question here is, did you have something at one point that was then taken from you and that is now lost? Or does the experience of loss itself retroactively figure this thing? In other words, were we once in Eden and then we got kicked out? Were we in this uteromorphic space of becoming and bliss, and then language and society took that from us, and that wholeness is now something that we lost? Lacan's answer is no. You didn't have that shit because you were that shit. Here's that split again between having and being. You didn't have Eden and then it was taken from you. You were that. And the only reason why I know you were that is because you feel like it's been taken from you now on the other side. It's the experience of loss, not the fact of losing something, that interests Lacan. And here's the deal. We don't need to get too caught up in this, but what is denied and prohibited when the paternal function comes in is any furthering of life without prohibition. That's the deal. You can't just pretend like that shit didn't happen, which is exactly what the psychotic does. Foreclosure is, that didn't happen. It's like repression on crank. It's something completely different. It's not even an acknowledgement that the thing occurred. It's that didn't even happen. The neurotic represses something that they fundamentally accept as occurring, which is this basic prohibition. The name of the Father is the no of the Father. And it's a prohibition against any more life without prohibition. And so, in other words, you're living your life, your bio-animal existence, and then there is a big fat no. This is crude, but it gets to the point. A big fat no introduced. You can't keep crying and expect to have your needs met. The kid is like, wait, what? And the parent says, no, you have to use words now. Holy shit. From that moment forward, the child is divided and has a choice. I can either keep crying and get in trouble, or I can use my words and maybe get what I think I need. Prior to that big fat no, there was only one path forward. But it wasn't experienced as a path because it was the only thing you knew. You were the here and now of becoming. The lizard was the rock, and the rock the lizard. It's only with the advent of the symbolic, with the name of the Father, that there is a distance imposed, introduced between these entities. It's the world of words, Lacan says, that engenders and creates the world of things. Before the world of words, it was just all of this shit in the imminent here and now of pure presence, bio-animal, fluid shit, which is not the same as consciousness. You were not aware of that. I was not aware of that. I only become aware of that retrospectively. It's a presupposed place. So think about it. What is your earliest memory? How old were you? 3, 4, 5? Let's say you were 3 years old. You've got a great memory. Your first memory is when you were 3 years old. Were you born 3 years old? Hell no. You were born 0 years old. And you survived for 3 years before anything like a memory popped up in your mind. Those 3 years are not 3 years of awareness. They are 3 years of animality. It's only in the hindsight of later years, when you can look back and discern your first memory, a memory that began at the age of 3, full well knowing that you weren't born at that age. So you presuppose some sort of human experience from years 0 to 3. It doesn't mean that you have any memory or recollection of that experience. You might see a picture here or there to prove it. Lacan's point is, it's only with the advent of split subjectivity and the introduction into language that you can look back and imagine at a fantastical level what it might have been like before, what it was like back in the day. But it is a fantasy. It is a fantasy of wholeness that is always experienced as loss. And I want to make the difference here very simple before we take a break. The difference that Chaim is working out here is between the word loss, L-O-S-S, and lost, L-O-S-T. It's the experience of being at a loss, of feeling like something is off, that elicits the fantasy that someday we might be complete and whole. And it's a fantasy that has a retrospective hook, because it suggests that this is not just a becoming something that we never were, but a return to a uteromorphic state of prelinguistic bliss. But that is a fantasy. In fact, if you ask me, bioanimality is a horrific, terrifying place to be. Like, think about that shit. You have 0 motor skills, but by 6 months you have an elaborate perceptual apparatus. You can basically see people walking around and almost stepping on your ass and not being able to do anything about it. At some level, you can see the world around you, and yet you have no ability to affect it. I can't imagine a more vulnerable state. Regardless, all I can do is imagine it because I have no memory of it. It doesn't mean it didn't occur. It just means that in order for me to experience it, I can only experience it at the level of the imaginary. And some people would say that's even exactly what the imagination is. It is a desensing of one's Umwelt, the world around you. A desensing, a transforming of it into images. This is the Augustine tradition all the way up to Kant. The imagination is an imaging of the world. You desense it, leaving images behind. Images that can then become food for thought, which were known as memories. Memories were the food of thought, and memories were images of the world desensed. But that's another discussion. For our purposes, I think it's important to just remember the difference between the experience and the feeling of loss and the experience of losing something. We'll get after this a little bit more, but I want to give you all 10 minutes. It's 7:45 now. We've been at it for about an hour and 45 minutes. So take 10, come back here at 7:53, and we'll pick up where this discussion left off and make a few more moves. All right, see you in a minute. Thank you for your punctuality, y'all. Come on back. You know what I love about this group? Is there a connection between this negative phi and phallic jouissance? Hold on, let me get this chat up again. Let's see. Is there a connection between this negative phi and phallic jouissance or feminine jouissance? Yes, there is. Because this negative phi business is the structuring element for the symbolic order, which is where phallic jouissance involves itself. So it's this negative phi here is in some places even Lacan will mess around and transform this into the phallic signifier, which is another term that he comes up with. Not the imaginary phallus, but the phallic signifier. But just because it has the word phallic in it, the main thing to remember is Bruce Fink does a good job with this, I think, is that remember that phallus is of the same etymological origin as failure and fallibility. And that's what the phallus is designed to indicate. It's to indicate incompletion, inadequacy, something that you struggle with. It's a fault, if you will. And think fault line here too. These are all etymological origins of the word phallus. And that's what we know about phallic jouissance, is that it is a failed jouissance. It is a faulted jouissance. I would hold that in mind. But yeah, the symbolic structure that is constituted by the paternal function, which results in this negative phi, is the world in which phallic jouissance will take root. So the answer is yes. What's interesting about this question, and the reason why I appreciate it so much, is that it reminds me of where we are. And it reminds me that what we're really doing here, and what Seminar 10 invites us to do, is to really dig deep into the conceptual foundations of Lacanian psychoanalysis. That's what we're doing here. And that's an interesting place to be. The reason why I want us to be at this place is because once you arrive at the foundations, you can look up and see all the other pieces and how they work. And that's what this question really reminds me of, is that phallic jouissance is something that is of interest to a lot of you, especially as it relates to the other jouissance, feminine jouissance, so to speak, from Seminar 20. Here, where we find ourselves now with this negative phi, is one of the great foundations for Lacan's phallic thought. There are essays in EURIAS 2 that you should check out as well. Signification of the phallus, Subversion of the subject, these are all great ones. But this seminar is really terrific for this stuff. And it goes back even further. This is like the third or fourth year in a row that Lacan has been making good use of the phallus. But just remember, the key thing here is faulted. And this gets us back to the question that we paused on. Kimes was a good one about loss versus lost. Is it that we had uteromorphic bliss and then it was taken from us? Or is it something else? Lacan's answer is it's something else. Here's how we get there. So The other big other, the symbolic that we started talking about tonight, what we know about this is that it precedes us. It's another word for society, language, order, law. It precedes the self. Again, this is what Heidegger meant by thrownness. We're thrown into a world not of our own design. Other people designed it for us. They carved out places for us in law and language and subjectivity and asked us to occupy it. They drug us into this world. Don't think about where they drug us out of or where they drug us from. Think about what we got drug into. This dragging into society is the process known as subjectivization, and it always results in a split subject. Split between embodiment and language, the enunciating subject and the grammatical subject, the bio-animal material body that experiences need and cold and hunger, and the socio-linguistic body that can now exist at the level of a name on an envelope or on a screen in our cases here. So the split subjectivity that Lacan introduces us to, it has these two fundamental elements. There's a biomaterial component that came with us when we entered the symbolic. And there's a large part of that bodily environment that receives representation. But think about how many body parts are in your no-no zone. The no-no zone that as a child you were told were your private parts, which were parts you weren't supposed to talk about, parts that the symbolic didn't have a lot of available appropriate terms for discussing. This is part of what Lacan is getting at when he talks about Objectility, this little a. This little a is whatever gets cut out and off of the body in this process of subjectivation and gets thrown to the side into your no-no zone. Oh, we don't talk about that. We don't do that here. Don't touch yourself there. Don't think about this. Don't deal with that. We don't make those noises, et cetera, et cetera. You should be embarrassed when you fart and burp and all this kind of, all the bodily mechanisms and parts that society deems inappropriate are rejected from the symbolic. And they become little a's. Little a is what is cut out of the symbolic. It is the basis for the real. The real did not precede the symbolic. Conceptually speaking, the real is an effect structure of the symbolic. It's whatever of biomaterial existence the symbolic cannot account for, and thus places under erasure. Everything in your no-no zone, swimsuit zone, genitals, all this kind of stuff that we don't talk about, that's all shit that gets pushed into the real. The reason why Lacan, as Carolina pointed out last time, is attaching the real to objet A, to this little a, is because it's that pound of flesh, that body part that gets ejected from the process of subjectivation. The impulsive side of us, the embodied side of us. We'll come to that in a second. The point I want to get at here is that when you are drug into the symbolic, that is effectively a prohibitive process. The name and know of the Father is a prohibition that says, and you can't live as though this world doesn't exist anymore. When you're drug into the world of the symbolic, what may have been experienced as a here and now of the all in a process of becoming is now transformed into a before and after. The here and now is now subject to a logic of before and after. And the before can only be figured and thought and imagined retroactively, because it's only in the after we've been introduced to the symbolic, that we have the terms to experience anything like a memory or knowledge of this presupposed bioanimal existence. Now, I bring this up because what I want to suggest is that one of the basic experiences that we have is the experience of a lack of wholeness. So I'm trying to get back at that question we ended with before the break from Chaim about what are we doing here with loss, which of course was started by Cody talking about the lost object. And it's all right on point here with little a. I want to try, as always, to be as grounded and clear as possible as this. It's not that we were once whole and that we have since lost this. It's not that we were living a blissful life and then the symbolic deprived us of that, but that we can only access wholeness at a loss in the experience of lack. That's the important part here. It's not that wholeness was once had and is now lost. It's that the only way we have of accessing it is in this symbolic sphere in which we always live lives of loss, of lack. We are always at a loss, if you will, when imagining what it might be like to be whole. The problem is we always want to add the word again to the fantasy of wholeness. So you want to go out into the wild and get your head right. You're going to go to some hot springs. You're going to immerse yourself in the uteromorphic sulfuric space of 102-degree groundswell of water. You're going to put hot mud on your body. You're doing the whole thing. Come on, man, that shit is great. You're going to get back to nature. You're going to be one with nature. You see, we have all these uteromorphic bubble-like experiences that we pursue. I have a friend who likes to get buried in cedar mulch chips. He thinks that shit is just lit. It's like tingly and hot. He just loves it. Cooks his ass in mulch chips on a regular basis. Other people like bathtubs. Some people like to swim. Others like to go out into the wild, as we've discussed tonight. The problem is that that pursuit of wholeness, we know where it starts. It starts from the experience of feeling unwholely, incomplete, lacking. It's because we're lacking that we pursue completion, wholeness. The problem is that we think that the experience of lack is the result of having something taken from us. That's not it. It's not that the path we were once on was taken from us. It's that the path we were once on now has forked. And from now on, you will have always made a choice. And you have to continually make the choice. The split subject must always decide which part of self is going to be in the driver's seat. The embodied, impulsive, libidinal part, known as the enunciating subject, or the socio-linguistified, subjectified, symbolified, signified, linguistified part of the self, known as the grammatical subject. In this split subject, we also know, however, that there is always a third element. Where two or more have gathered, you will always have a third. In fact, there's no such thing as two or more. It's always two and more. The reason why it's always two and more is because there must be a third element, a gap, an irreducible minimum distance between those two entities that allows them to remain distinct, two entities. If that gap weren't there, if that space weren't there, they would become one. This is the horror of anxiety. Somebody fucking ingests you. You are drawn in, enveloped, consumed by another's desire. Fuck you and your desire. You're going to feed mine. That's a horrifying place to be. One of the examples that I've mentioned before that's worth noting here again is Lacan has the jaws of the maternal function likened to that of a crocodile or an alligator. And the child is this little bird, if you will, sitting in the mouth. And at any moment, those jaws can clamp down. The paternal function, the phallic signifier, if you will, Lacan refers to it almost like a rolling pin that is effectively shoved into the jaws of the maternal function in order to keep them from closing. So here's the phallus, here are the jaws, the phallus is put in there, and now the jaws can't close because there is an irreducible distance that the phallic signifier introduces and maintains. Without that, the jaws could snap closed. But because we have it here, lodged in the back of mommy's mouth, mind you, the phallus is able to keep the jaws open and to keep them from smashing down and consuming the baby bird. Okay, what this means then, as you heard me say earlier, is that to study psychoanalysis, according to Lacan, and this really radical function of lack that he says on 131 is basically like the big moment for him. In other words, anxiety introduces us with the accent of utmost communicability to a function that is for our field radical, the function of lack. Remember this on page 131. In order to study lack, you have to study the term or the sign that Lacan uses to symbolize it, this little a. Little a is the symbol for a lack. This, though, little a, is not an object. Lack is not an object. Open your books to page 214 and 215, and you'll see him trying to work this out. It is not an easy thought, but it's one that he is dedicated to. The last full paragraph that begins, our vocabulary has endorsed, on page 214. Note this line just above it. Look at how he defines A. It's the object of objects. He's not fucking around. He's trying to get at the origin of objecthood. Our vocabulary has endorsed for this object, this A, this object of objects, the term objectility, insofar as it stands in contrast to the term objectivity. To encapsulate this contrast in some brief formulas, we shall say that objectivity is the ultimate term in Western scientific thought. The correlate to pure reason, which at the end of the day is translated into, is summed up by, is spelt out in a logical formalism. If you've been following my teaching over the last 5 or 6 years, which of course everybody on this call certainly has been doing, you know that objectility is something else. To bring it out in its vital point and forge a formula that balances up with the previous one, here's the key point, everybody. I will say that objectility is the correlate to the pathos of the cut. Now, this cut is not an object. It's a gap in which an object may have been there. Imaginary phallus, is that an object? What kind of object is that? It's an imaginary object in a dual relation that's been placed under erasure or at least denied. Objectality, what Lacan is doing, is about the pathos of the cut. And then look at the top of page 215. Actually, start at the bottom of 214. It just helps. Even Kant, especially Kant, I will say, remains steeped in causality. Remember, the cut is the cause for Lacan. remains suspended from the justification that so far no a priori has ever managed to reduce of this function, which is essential to the whole mechanism of the lived experience of our mental life, the function of cause. The difference between objectality and objectivity is that objectivity deals with the world of objects after the word has engendered them. Objectality deals with the opening moment and utterance of the world. If it's the world of words that creates the worlds of things, objectality studies the origin of the world of words. And the first word, you've heard me say it, no matter what it literally was for you, its function was that of the no, of prohibition. The world of words engenders the world of things, of objects. That's where modern science is hanging out, in the world of things. Lacan goes back to the world of words, linguistics, communication. And now he's going back even further to the first word, which, as you now know, was the word N-O, no. The function of that word was prohibitive. And the effect of that prohibition was lack. The reason why I say that is that after the name or the no of the Father has been uttered, you, because you're neurotic, like me, can no longer live life as though it hasn't happened. There's no further living of life without prohibition. And what that does then is it introduces this split that we've been talking about at length. And in order to have that split, you have to have a gap or a cut between the two entities, one part of self and the other. That is where cause comes in. The cause of the world of things is the world of words. The cause of the world of words is the cut. That's where Lacan is with this material. And now what we want to do is figure out the nature of this cut and its byproduct. You've seen this before. If you want to see this rendered in one of our handy dandy formulas, check it out, y'all. Here we are again with our handy black screen. You've seen this before. Here's desire. And we know that desire is always pointed towards stuff, which we'll just represent here as X. This is the world of objects. What we know, though, is that there's a big difference between the object of desire and its cause. The reason why you want something is because you don't have it. I can't emphasize this enough, and I hope at this point that you're tired of hearing it from me. This is what you want, and we all have this, if we're lucky. This is why we want. We want it because we don't have it. The cause of our desire is our lack of the thing that we experience as missing. We could even take this a step further and get a little playful here. What we fundamentally desire, the what, is a desire for recognition. We want to be seen by others as appealing, as desirable, as acceptable. That's why the math theme for fantasy is a split subject, somebody who feels inadequate most of the time, living their life in relation to whatever they think other people might want. Don't get confused. Here's another use of the little a that precedes the one we're working with now. This is fantasy, a desire to be recognized as likable, as effective, whatever the case may be. This, however, is not what interests Lacan. All this shit over here is boring for him. We all know this about desire. More interesting to Lacan is why we desire recognition. And once you start pushing back into the field of what he calls objectility, into the field of the cause, we discover something different. Not the desire for recognition, but a recognition of how desire works. Not the desire for recognition, but a recognition of desire. Some people think that desire, the theory of desire that Lacan puts forth, is his greatest contribution to psychoanalysis. I personally don't feel that way, but this is what they mean. This is why they think it's such a great contribution, because it shifts the question of desire away from the object of desire and back towards the cause of desire, which in this case is lack. We've talked about this a bunch. For our purposes, right now, dealing with anxiety, so to speak, it's this. This little a, which is a symbol of lack. An algebraic sign, and little more, is what we're working on. Let's take a second for a couple of quick questions before we take the next move and start talking about body parts. Where are you all sitting with this?
It's funny. I guess I have a question about the paternal function, despite us, I feel like talking about it on repeat.
It's the key. It's the key. So don't even trip. If you've got a question, everybody else does too.
Yeah. So I was talking to a Lacanian analyst, and he was talking about this patient who he has, and he was saying that the patient's father, so the patient's like 17, patient's father is just constantly castrating him, just constant excessive paternal function. No. And in my opinion, I think it's completely destroyed his ability to desire, which is interesting because his mother is doing what we've been talking about as well, which is this overwhelming, too close, too proximate, devouring, right? Essentially. So yeah, I don't know what you have to say about that. Can the paternal function also function as a function in the way that it creates anxiety in the subject?
Yes. Yes, it can.
All right.
Remember that when I have written the name of the father, I've always made it also the no of the father, right? And usually when I write this, the punctuation that I offer after the no is a period. There are, unfortunately, lots and lots and lots of primary caregivers who exercise the paternal function with an exclamation mark instead of a period. This is the no that is not kept 300. Cool, calm, collected, consistent, add your C's. We can make this a 600. That key thing though is calm, consistent, and cool. No, that's not how we do this. No, we've talked about this now. We've talked about this. You know that the way that we use the bathroom is we go in and we knock on the door first. We don't just come running in. And we try and aim for the toilet. We don't aim for the walls. Like we're trying to like act, we've been over this. That is a paternal function well delivered. Oh my God, don't do that. No, 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 no. That's not. The former would not result in anxiety. The latter will. But it's not all that can happen. This 17-year-old patient who has a dad who is just as smothering as the mom, but in a very prohibitive, constraining way, what can very likely happen there is perversion. One of the ways that you get a pervert is you have the name of the father pronounced not impassively, but at the level of jouissance, with enjoyment, with ferocity, with intensity. Affective intensity is the great word here. If the no or prohibition occurs with an extreme affective intensity, like in other words, if it always has an exclamation point at the end, or the threat of violence attached to it, if you piss on the wall one more time, I'm going to cut your dick off. I'm going to hit you so hard you're going to piss your pants. I mean, parents say this kind of shit to kids. They absolutely say this kind of shit, and they do these types of things to kids. A lot of the guys in this men's group that I was mentioning to you, the horror stories that these men have about growing up, tied up with extension cords, beaten with coat hangers, beaten and then having an addict's parent go take a break to smoke more crack and tell the kid, don't fucking move, I'm not done beating you. And then coming back and beating them some more. The horrors, all of you in clinical work, you know this way too well, unfortunately. This shit is real, and I do mean that. The no, though, that comes with a threat of violence, whether that threat is acted upon or not. We talked about this a couple sessions ago, but what happens here is that the law, which is what the no as prohibition effectively enunciates, the law here gets confused with the lawgiver. A good law is a law that can endure a change of power. A bad law, so to speak, is one that only is effective insofar as the lawgiver is there to back it up with the threat of violence. So the example that we had a couple of weeks ago, I think, was of the American Wild West movie, where the hero comes in out of the desert, the town is lawless, he cleans up the town. But at the end of the film, the exact same thing always occurs. The lawgiver leaves. One of the most stereotypical parts of the American Western film is the hero riding off into the sunset. That is the lawgiver, having cleaned up the town, leaving it. What is left behind? What is left behind is the law. The town can now take care of itself without the barrel of the gun of the lawgiver there to back it up. In the case of the neurotic, the no that is pronounced with a period at the end, coolly, calmly, collectedly, consistently, is gradually introjected and internalized. And eventually you'll have the law of the primary caregiver in your brain. And when you start thinking about doing something like pissing on the wall, you'll think otherwise. The job of the superego is to show up and censor that action. Sometimes sadistically, by the way, almost always sadistically, unfortunately. But that's a neurotic subject at work. The pervert, though, is somebody who learned that the authority of the no is only binding insofar as it has a threat of violence attached to it, of bodily harm, of extreme affective intensity at the level of the lawgiver bearing down violently and at the level of the law bearer receiving said violence. Now here's the deal. The two basic clinical substructures of perversion are sadism and masochism, which exercise themselves in an effort to get an amplified, intensified law pronounced. Weirdly enough, the law that is screamed at the child day in and day out never really takes hold. The only thing that takes hold is a relationship with the law that is premised on affective intensity. That's what takes hold. What takes hold is not the law, but a feeling that law is only authoritative insofar as it's bound up with jouissance. And that, let's face it, that's the last thing you want in a judge or a cop. Pick your end of the court system, of the criminal law system. You don't want a cop that is like, man, it's my lucky day. I got this new taser and I can't wait to fucking use it on somebody. Let's just hope there are minoritized subjectivities so I can get away with this. That's like terrifying. That's fucking terrifying. That's why there's so many horrifying thrillers, psychological and otherwise, where the cop is kind of twisted and mean. That's some scary shit. Because the police have a monopolization on the legitimate use of force. And now you've got somebody who uses it for their own benefit, for their own jouissance. They don't just, look at the Rodney King video from the 90s. Look at that shit. Rodney King is down. They're dancing around him, beating the shit out of him, taking turns hitting him with sticks. He's down. He don't need to be hit no more. Flash forward to police brutality again. One of the classic symptoms of this is a cop with a knee on the back of somebody's neck and a smile on his face. He's enjoying this. That's the last thing you want in a cop. Someone for whom the pronouncement of the law is bound up with their own enjoyment. Same with a judge. You want a judge who's going to pass a verdict and say, I hereby declare blah, 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 without a grin, without a snarl. The scary judge is the one who says, if I had my druthers, I'd take you out back and hang you myself. But I am bound by the law, so at the very least, I'm sentencing you to a maximum sentence of blah, 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 and you have this kind of judge, and the camera zooms in for an extreme close-up, and you can see a little bit of spittle on the judge's lip as they bang that gavel. The gavel is a good example of this. A judge that operationalizes the no period can hit the gavel once or twice. A judge who embodies the sadistic, perverse relationship to the law is the one depicted as taking that gavel and smacking it so much so that the pad that the gavel hits starts jumping up and down, maybe even the head of the gavel breaks off. So that's another result that can come of this, Cody. A 17-year-old who has a dad constantly screaming no at him, that kid would be lucky to get out of there with anxiety. A more likely outcome, if it's, I don't know how bad it is, but if it's as intense as this guy is saying, would be clinical structure of perversion. Now, I don't know the relationship to the mother, but what could come of this is a kid who, as pervert, thinks that he can go ahead and give it to mommy. He deserves to be her bad little boy, to be the object of her jouissance that brings her enjoyment. He receives daddy's enjoyment at the level of the no exclamation point, And he in turn passes that on to mommy by being her symbolic dildo. That is one way that we see the pervert operating too. The pervert gets off on producing anxiety in others, but what they tell themselves is, I'm just giving the other pleasure. Not even pleasure, enjoyment. I'm there to get them off. The pervert is somebody who says, I want you to just tie me to the bed, put a bag over my head and fuck me. Turn me into your dildo. That's a perverse move. So there are all kinds of permutations that can come of this. The most important one for Lacan would be a perverse relationship to the law, where the law constantly needs amplification because it never took root in a, quote, normal average way. Because it always was bound up with the vociferousness of the lawgiver and the jouissance of the lawgiver, those two get confused. The pervert has confused the jouissance of the lawgiver for the rationality of the law. So without further case notes, I couldn't say more. I don't know if I should be saying anything now anyway, but I think it's great that you're actually talking with a practicing Lacanian. I think you get some good use out of that for sure. What else is out there? I always want these sessions to be as much a response to you as they are a trotting out of what I read as key points in the Lacan text.
Coming back to temporality and the functional time, because we caught it a few different ways. Like, so even going back to the lower left, the signifier of the big other, it's like the difference between the other as the locus, the treasure trove, right, of the signifiers, and then the signifier that is being offered right now in this moment for this representation. I mean, there's all these sort of punctuations of time that happen, and then the cleft between the having the before versus the after versus the here and now thing. So it keeps, I don't know, again, I don't have like a cohesive question, but it just keeps feeling like time is like this slippery thing that pulls it all together, because we talk about it directly in the retro version of the, like, okay, we figure out the chain after the fact. But is time, I guess I'm putting it in the symbolic, but I feel like it also has its own discrete function that maybe is like its own fourth-legged deity that should allow that.
Yeah. Time is one of the key conceptual backbones of Lacanian thought. And the reason why I say that is because he has a twofold theory of time. And he borrows some of this from Freud, but he does something more with it. So Lacan always has a chronological sense of time as one part, time as unfolding the way music does, one note after the other. Like an entire composition couldn't happen all at once. It would just sound like, ah. The music has to unfold the way a melody does, one note at a time. That chronological, dare I say, progressive unfolding of time, A to B to C to D, that linear chronological assessment of time is how, according to Lacan, language unfolds. Speech, when spoken, unfolds like a melody, one word at a time. But it's only at the end of the utterance, at the end of the sentence where the punctuation mark is, that we can look back retrospectively and understand the meaning of what was said. So here it is. Speech unfolds linearly in time for Lacan, diachronically. Meaning, however, is retroactive. It's synchronic. Meaning is always backward looking, which is why the symbol of wisdom in the West is typically an owl. Not because owls can turn their heads all the way around, but because they only come out at dusk. At the end of the day, when all the day's deeds are done, the owl of Minerva takes flight. Wisdom is hindsight. just like vision is 20/20 when looking back. So let's take an example really quick just to capture these two threads of time, which you may have heard before. Here it is unfolding in time, but notice how it's not until the end of the sentence that we understand anything. Jack and Jill, at a very young age, were exposed to. Now, until I fill in the blank, until I tell you what they were exposed to, you don't really know anything about Jack or Jill. Jack and Jill, at a very young age, were exposed to another language. Okay, now we can look back and say, oh, okay, Jack and Jill must have been like some cultured people, or maybe they just happened to live in Europe, or maybe they blah, 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 you know. Jack and Jill at a very young age were exposed to their uncle's genitals. Okay, now we have a different understanding of Jack and Jill. Lacan's point is, life has to be lived forward, but it can only be understood backward. Meaning is retroactive, but living is continuous. And if you have ears to hear, you know that I'm also here quoting Soren Kierkegaard. One of the basic definitions of existentialism is the dilemma associated with the fact that life can only be lived forward and understood backward. So there are several figures in the Western tradition that have really robust theories of time. All of them include theories of retroactivity. Lacan is one of them. Second only, I would argue, to Walter Benjamin. Benjamin actually made a thing of retroactive theories of time. Some of you have read my stuff on this. I'm not going to go into it much, but it's worth looking at. And it's worth holding in mind because, again, time is one of the conceptual backbones of what Lacan is doing. And just remember, speech unfolds linearly according to the Greek notion of chronos, but meaning is retroactive. It's not chronos, but kairos. It's more about the moment of punctuation. I could go on and on about this as I have in other lectures, but I think it's worth bearing in mind here because it does get after this notion of the lost object. And it does get into this notion on page 174 and 175 with this table where big A and big S are at the top. And Lacan has rather dangerously, I would argue, written jouissance next to that. The way to understand that jouissance is that it's a retroactive, retrospective assignment of jouissance. It's a pre-linguistic jouissance. Might even call it like a J1 or something like that. It's not technically jouissance that the subject of pure need experiences, because jouissance is an effect of symbolic integration, of subjectivation. Jouissance doesn't fit there, which is why Lacan elsewhere in the development of that table refers to this as a kind of X factor. We'll come to it in a second, but I want you to know that this question of time is deeply relevant to what he's doing here. The experience of being at a loss is very much bound up with retrospection. And it is the key, I think, to understanding the difference between a lost object and the experience of loss. I think we'll be able to make some heads and tails of this, if not this time, then in a couple of weeks. How much do you want to talk about the fact that Lacan assigns this lost or cut off part as a body part? This starts on page 160, where he says that after the ordeal of the signifierization of the subject, after the ordeal of the symbolic, little a is what's left. A real leftover, an irreducible leftover, he says, on 160 and 161. This is what Carolina had us onto last time. This is also, you'll note on page 160, where Lacan starts developing this table. And you can see on 161, there's that X factor. He has not yet inserted jouissance there, because this is a mythical, presupposed, retroactively configured alignment. In many ways, that's what that horizontal line indicates. A presuppositional line. Existence only occurs below that line. Everything above it is in the field of presuppositionality. You can see this here as well on 161. To connote the three stages of the operation of division, we shall say that here at the start there is an X that we can only name retroactively, which is properly speaking the inroad to the other. Blah, 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 blah. This is all about the subject of pure need. That's what that capital S is there. So if you wanted to like trace this thing out, here's how you do it. Just a moment. Okay, so if you have this table here in the middle, this is the subject of pure need that we've discussed. Here is the whole big other as treasure trove, which we've also discussed. Here's this little a that we've been working so hard on. Here's the split subject, which we've also discussed. And here's the barred other. The X here that would later become jouissance for Lacan is mythical. Presupposed. A priori, if you will. At this other level here, we have anxiety. And down here, we have desire. The first thing to understand about this is the procedure that Lacan suggests. There's a whole subject of pure need that is driven into the symbolic. And what is produced in this process are these two entities. So this is very much what we talked about as the subject of pure need, has to address big other, and one of the things that comes of this is a split subject, but something also escapes leading up to desire. And here's that little a. So this is the same modeling that we've seen. It's just rendered a little bit differently in order for Lacan to get these three tiers. So don't think that he's doing something totally different with this table. Cody's point that he wants to talk about is anxiety as this median, not mediating, but median between desire and what Lacan is eventually going to call jouissance. Here, this kind of X factor on page 161. What I think is worth noting is that this little a that is produced as a leftover, as a spin-out product of the subject of pure needs integration and splitting in and by the symbolic is something real. It is the scrap of embodiment that the big other cannot process. An irreducible scrap of embodiment. You can think of this on 161, about 10 lines down. This is the A. It's an irreducible aspect of the subject. It's what remains of the irreducible in the complete operation of the subject's advent in the locus of the other, and it is from this that it will derive its function. Little a will derive its function as what represents the S in its irreducible real. This is, in other words, at the level of the severed, cut, removed, torn out body part. What Lacan on 215 is going to call a corporal morsel, a portion of our flesh, a piece of our body. Little a here is something real. It's a real piece of flesh. It's the part of us as embodied beings that the big other just doesn't have a word for. That's the great definition of little a that we get in Seminar 10. It starts to take on the properties of the real. For just this reason. Now blast forward to that page I just mentioned, 215, and notice the move Lacan makes here. Here again we see, just after we were reading about objectality in the business, that little a on 215 is something irreducible, portion of our flesh that is snagged in the formal machine. Here's that corporal morsel that's torn from us. Blah, 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 blah. Now scroll down here to this paragraph that begins, this bodily portion of ourselves on 215. Check this out. Note the move he makes. This bodily portion of ourselves is essentially and functionally partial. It should be remembered that this portion is a body and that we are objectal, which means that we are only objects of desire as bodies. This is a crucial point to bear in mind because calling upon something else, calling upon some substitute or other, is one of the fields that creates denegation. Desire, here's the key point, always remains in the last instance the desire of a body. Desire for the other's body, and nothing but the desire for this body. And then he gives us some examples. I want your heart. Language here, he says, betrays the truth. What I want from you is not just your love. I want the organ that pumps blood through your body. I want your body part. And then in the next paragraph on 216, he then is back to circumcision and the foreskin. This is all about locating little a in a body part that has been rendered as waste, leftover, refuse, worthless. It's a wonder to me, given some of the recent videos I've been watching on Netflix, why he wouldn't invoke the clitoris more at this point. Why so much time spent on the foreskin? Wouldn't the clit be this part of human anatomy that has been cast out, placed under erasure, and the like? In fact, when exactly did scientists begin to map anatomically the full extent of the clitoris? We didn't know shit about this thing for a very long time. And now we finally have an anatomical map of just how extensive and elaborate this aspect of human anatomy is. Now think about the constant subordination of female anatomical orgasm to male anatomical orgasm. If ever there was a part of the body that has been rendered as refuse, remainder, cast off, shoved aside, in other words, made into a little a, it would be utterly the parts of woman's anatomical body. And yet Lacan doesn't spend much time with that. Thankfully, though, we have Netflix. You can find the shows I'm mentioning. They're quite popular right now. but it would be a good example of how that little a, societally speaking, is indeed always a body part that has been cast out, the same way that the foreskin is cast out. Now let's think about this table really quick. How do you feel about this thing? I'm prepared to take more steps, but I don't want to move too fast with this if there's more you want to talk about at this level. By all means. I'm just erasing this to be clear. Okay, then let's go over the parts one more time. Here's the subject of pure need. This is that little diamond, or I'm sorry, that little triangle that we messed with in the past. I'll just put a little slash here so you know that this is the subject of pure need. It's wholly embodied. Okay, I think we can say that. This is a wholly embodied being. And then it encounters and is forced to filter itself through the big other. Society, law, order, language, the symbolic. It draws this wholly embodied being into what Lacan on 219 calls a signifying dialectic. In this signifying dialectic, something is separated off, sacrificed, the pound of flesh. That is this. This is what's sacrificed or forfeited in that moment. And we see this, pages 160, 161, up through 219. You can check it out. Little a here designates this pound of flesh that's been cut off as an irreducible remainder of the fully embodied subject of pure need, a remainder that occurs through the ordeal of castration, alienation, the division of the subject in and by the symbolic. Now we can start to see why Lacan uses the word castration. Castration, literally the cutting off of certain body parts to be cast aside. My great-grandfather used to take a cat, put its head in a cowboy boot, pull a penknife out, cut its testicles off, and just throw them to the dogs. And then take the cat's head out of the boot and turn it back loose. It's like a 20-second operation. But those nuts of the cat were worthless, rendered little more than dog food, subject only to the desire of the candid, if you can believe that has one. This is again why Lacan associates little a with the real on pages 160 to 61. It's what remains of the subject of pure need after the advent of split subjectivity in and by the symbolic. It's an irreducible real, which I think is a great way to understand this. And again, it's here in Seminar 10 that Lacan is really making this turn towards understanding little a as an irreducible real. Now, when he says it's irreducible, he means that whatever little a symbolizes, if you will, it's something that resists signifierization, Lacan says. It symbolizes what's lost in, on, and by the symbolic. And again, I'm not just making this shit up. Flip to page 174, where we see the latest and greatest iteration of this table. The first part is the part that Cody pointed us to about the median function of anxiety. What we're working on now, prior to getting to that median point, is the last paragraph on page 174. It may be as far as we can get at present, but it is definitely worth landing upon. What does this mean? To sketch out the translation of what I am designating, I might suggest that A comes to assume the function of the metaphor of the subject of jouissance. That use, subject of jouissance, is a stretch for Lacan. That's him wanting to replace that mythical retroactive X factor with a term that he thinks his audience is going to like. This would only be right if little a were deemed equivalent to a signifier. It is not. So we know it's not an object like other objects, and he's also going to tell us that it's a sign, but also not a signifier. Now, the little a is precisely what resists any assimilation to the function of a signifier. And this indeed is why it symbolizes that which in the sphere of the signifier always presents itself as lost, as what gets lost in signifierization. Now it is precisely this waste product, this scrap, which resists signifierization, that comes to find itself constituting the foundation of the desiring subject as such. Not the subject of jouissance now, but the subject on the path of his search, which is not a search for his jouissance. In wanting to bring this jouissance into the locus of the other as the locus of the signifier, however, the subject precipitates himself, anticipating himself as a desiring subject. So this little scrap represented by A is the cause, is the opening, or the lack, or the gap that gives desire its start. It's the origin of desire. Now the question becomes, how are we to understand this place of anxiety in our equation here? I'm not sure that we're going to be able to solve this one tonight, but I'm absolutely certain that what we have in this table on 174 can be adapted from the graph of desire and stretched in some pretty interesting directions. If I were to add one more twist to this, a twist that will allow us to end tonight on a rather interesting note, and one, of course, all the more interesting because I think Lacan would pretty thoroughly disagree with it. Here's how I would draw this thing. There's a kind of circular logic here. So if Lacan wants this X to be jouissance, a kind of mythical retroactive jouissance, we can call it a kind of J1, if you will, or maybe a J0. We can put all of our terms up here on this arrow and suggest that this is basically the arc of a subject in motion. Here we have somebody operating at the level of need. Demand is coming up here. Here we have desire and fantasy, hence desire being at the bottom. And I'm putting fantasy here because we know that the two basic elements of fantasy are now up and on display for us here. Somewhere along the way, though, we have this old term, signifier of lack in the other, that when pointed at us provokes anxiety. Hence, anxiety as the next step past desire. What I'd like to end by suggesting is that we are indeed, contrary to what Lacan suggests, looking at a subject here on the pathway to jouissance. And I want to end tonight by telling you what I think he means by this. In the final pages of his essay on the subversion of the subject, Lacan has a great quote. It's in a Cree around page 700. Castration means that jouissance has to be refused in order to be attained on the inverse scale of the law of desire. That is what I think is being mapped out here. This original retroactive mythical jouissance, if we really want to play this out in ways that I think are a little conceptually sloppy but are effective for getting the point across, must be renounced and refused in order to be regained. I don't like the word regained for reasons we've discussed. I like gained differently. This, though, remember, is retrospective, mythical. We don't have any knowledge of this. We don't have any memory of this experience. In the field of need, this type of experience was beyond us, full embodiment. It's only at the level of demand and desire that we start getting anything like consciousness and memory and the like. But I think this is what Lacan is getting at on page 700. A certain jouissance has to be given up. That's the jouissance that comes with being a subject of pure need, when you can cry and expect that your needs are going to be met. This process of castration means that that experience has to be given up. But if you stick with it and continue along this pathway, the law of desire, you get back to jouissance again. And I want to emphasize this because what I'd like to suggest for those of you that attended my summer lectures on the subversion of the subject essay, and for those of you that have seen those, if you haven't, let me know. They're online. I'm happy to share a link with you. One of the things we talk about is that topmost arc of the law of desire, which is, I would argue, the topmost arc in the graph of desire on page 4. The arrow that points from castration back to jouissance. If you were looking for a place for J2, I would put it at the very top of the graph of desire. We'll start there next time. We'll talk more about it. I realize also that that case study on page 188 and 189 is not one that we got to discuss tonight. So we're also going to have to put a bookmark in that one. But let's end with this rather wild reading of the table on 174 or 175 and let it percolate for a couple of weeks. All right, per usual, I'm happy to stick around for a few minutes and answer questions. We're 4 minutes over time, so I certainly don't want to hold you hostage, but I also want to make sure you get your money's worth. So by all means, fire away. What's on your brain? And if you got a dip, nice to see you. Love you. See you later. Here we are, y'all.
I like the piece of the taken versus the lost. I get the distinction you're making. There's something about it that, for me, represents, like, the takenness almost creates the positionality that places me in relationship, and the function of the other that I have to lift to, like, pursue this path. So something about that, and that's not maybe, something Lacan would approve of, right? To hold it that way, but there's something about that that, for me, kind of squares it. But, like, if it's something that was taken, whether it's by a person or by a function, then it requires to pursue a relationship to another. So there's something about that feels good to me.
Okay, hold up. I'm not sure if my internet connection or are you guys having trouble hearing Kime too, or is it just me?
I've been having trouble hearing Kime all night. I don't know. It sounds like your mic is like it's super muffled.
Weird. Okay.
Lean forward here, brother, and tell us what's on your mind.
Oh, you know what?
How about that? Is that better?
Yo, hey, where you been? Where you been? Where you been? Okay, yes, that's much better. Thank you. Please continue.
So you missed all the brilliant things I said all night? Great, perfect. No, something about,
No.
I appreciate like what you did or where